All right, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Natalie Stetson. I am the Executive Director of the Erie Canal Museum, and we have a very exciting topic to talk about today. This year is the bicentennial of the canal opening through Syracuse. It was supposed to be a year full of celebration and events, but things, of course, are a little bit different, and so we've decided to do at least one more lecture, one more time to talk about this monumental anniversary. And so Derrick has put together a lecture for us, which I'm very excited to hear. But before that, I have just a few commercials, as I always do. So again, thank you all so much for joining us, both on Facebook Live and on Zoom. Thank you so much to those of you who donated the $5 to be with us here on Zoom. When Derrick is all said and done, we'll go ahead and allow you to unmute, and you can ask questions. You're also welcome to ask questions in the chat box anytime during the lecture. Same with on Facebook. Go ahead and ask questions in the comments if you have them at any point, and then Derrick will get to questions at the end. I know this is cliche to say, but every dollar really helps. It's not too late to join us here on Zoom if you're interested, so you can go onto our website, donate that $5, and you can join us right away. I'll send those links out just as soon as I'm finished here. Just another quick commercial. Tomorrow, the 35th annual Gingerbread Gallery opens. It supports the Erie Canal Museum year-round. We have 31 amazing creations on display for your viewing pleasure in storefront windows. This year, of course, is a little bit different. Time tickets are required, and you must purchase them ahead of time before entering the museum. We will not be able to accommodate walk-in visitors. So we just want to make sure we're keeping everyone as safe as possible, keeping the staff safe, keeping our visitors safe as best we can. And the Gingerbread Gallery will be open for in-person viewing as long as it's safe for us to do so. If you do not feel comfortable coming into the museum, there will be a virtual version available, a video that you can purchase, or if you're a member, you will get it for free. That will have a nice viewing experience of the gallery, and then also nice close-ups of each of the creations. So we're very excited. It's starting to feel very festive in a year that maybe hasn't felt very festive. So hopefully you'll come and join us for the Gingerbread Gallery, and we'll just keep celebrating until 2020 is over. But with that commercial, I'm gonna turn things over to Derrick Pratt, our museum educator, who is going to talk about that first year that the canal was open here through central New York. So Derrick, I'm gonna mute myself and let you take it away.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm glad that the phone call, we've already got that out of the way in the background. We're hitting all of our Zoom check marks so far with technical difficulties, unforeseen noises in the background. Well, anyway, thanks for joining us, folks. And I'm going to bring my PowerPoint up here. As Natalie said, I'm Derrick Pratt, our educator here at the museum. Excited for this? Come on, play. There we go. Should be full screen here. Thanks for joining us for this great talk on the initial season of navigation on the Erie Canal. Again, if you have any questions, please ask them in the comments. We will be sure to get back to you. Also, please, especially if you're on Facebook Live, say hi, comment on where you're watching from. It just helps more people to see the live stream. But anyway, let's get started here, shall we? With Open for Business, the 1820 season on the Erie Canal. Just wanted to go over real quick, talk about sources. My major source, I consulted on FultonHistory.com. It's a really great website that archives a lot of historical newspapers. I was able to find the Onondaga Register, which was published just a little to the south of here in Onondaga Hollow, New York. That They have most of the papers from 1820, so that was a very valuable resource. Also consulted a lot. This book, Bond of Union by Gerard Copel, which is a fascinating look at the building of the canal. And I'll talk about a few other sources that we consulted from time to time throughout this talk. So just wanted to get that out there. Also, like Natalie said, we've talked several times about the 1820 season already this year. So some things I'm going to not go into full depth on, but if you check out our YouTube channel, we should have posted a link to that in the comments. You will be able to find out more in-depth information on the Montezuma, the 4th of July celebrations in Syracuse, and the first 2-ish months of operations on the canal. But we only have an hour here, and each one of those talks took an hour. So yeah, you should watch those if you want the full scoop, and if you have 4 hours to kill. So let's talk about 1820, and let's bring ourselves up to speed on the Erie Canal. Here's a little timeline here. We see in 1817. At the moment, we're celebrating on the Erie Canal the bicentennial of the canal for full 8 years. It was constructed between 1817 and 1825. Work famously began in Rome, New York on July 4th. It was a pretty low-key affair, honestly. Not a lot of New York State dignitaries were there. It was really the who's who of Rome that was doing this digging. And they start in Rome because it's on what's known as the Long Level, this 60-plus mile stretch of canal that didn't require a single lock. So that's just why they start in Rome, because it's the easiest part to build. And let's not forget that in 1817, there are no trained American-born engineers yet. They're learning the trade of canal building. So they're working on getting, like, how do we dig this ditch properly? That part. 1818, they're really going to start to experience some of their first major engineering challenges, aqueducts, the first couple of locks. But work progresses incredibly well because there aren't a ton of these obstacles on this section of the canal. And by 1819, most of the 96 miles between the Seneca River at Montezuma and the Mohawk River at Utica are complete. And on October 23rd, the first boat trip is going to happen on the canal when the chief engineer of Rome, obviously it's a boat from Rome, will travel from Rome to Utica. But that will run into some hiccups. Remember, this is an experimental run. Part of the wall around Oriskany gives out during that voyage. And so everything's not perfect there, but it's starting to get better. And by 1820, they will have worked out a lot of those kinks. We're going to see that they didn't work out all of them yet, but they're getting there. And so in 1820, that middle section that I just mentioned is complete. So let's move on. But before we talk about the rest of what happened on the canal, I think it's important for us to remember that the Erie Canal, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. And we need to remember the context in which the canal was being built. So let's look at what was happening kind of around the world and around the country when the Erie Canal was being built globally. In the UK, George III, everyone's favorite tyrant that the United States of America rebelled against, he finally passes away after 59 years of rule, though he had famously the regency for a few years, for a number of years, actually, before he passed away. Also, there's a thing known as the Cato Street conspiracy occurring in England, where that was an attempt to assassinate the British cabinet. So both of those make it into the Onondaga Register, which we look at extensively in this talk. In Latin America, the revolutions of Latin America are occurring while this is during 1820. This is kind of their height. In fact, the revolutions against the Spanish crown have actually migrated into Spain, even as an expedition to head to South America rebels in the port of Cadiz and forces the King of Spain to sign a much more liberal constitution, which is chronicled extensively. This whole kind of fiasco that goes on in the Onondaga Register. So it's an era where people are really excited by these democratic ideas that are starting to sweep the entire globe. And that is expressed a lot in many of these celebrations we're going to see and in the Onondaga Register. Also, this is an era, this did not make it into the Onondaga Register, but I thought it was an important thing to mention. 1820 is the year that the famous HMS Beagle sets sail. On board the Beagle will be Charles Darwin, who will set forth the Erie Canal is going to create what's known as the transportation revolution. Darwin will create a revolution of his own in terms of science. And this Beagle's trip, it's just part of a much larger interest that's being taken into science and technology at this time, which the Erie Canal is a great example of. We see in the Onondaga Register, they talk about in Ohio, a man by the name of Caleb Atwater is sending reports, which they report in the Onondaga Register about the flora and fauna of Ohio. They also report in the register that a steamship has actually made the voyage from New York City to New Orleans for the first time. So there's a lot of really exciting scientific things going on. But an interesting thing to note, I think, about how the HMS Beagle setting sail, it doesn't make it into this historical record, which is the Onondaga Register. So while some things that are going to have some of the largest impacts globally, they are things that don't make it into this paper, which is interesting because they didn't realize it at the time. Nationally, this is the era of good feelings, as it's known. The biggest issue occurring in 1820 is the debate over the Missouri Compromise, which dealt with the expansion of slavery into the Western territories of New York. I mean, not New York, the United States, the Louisiana Purchase. That occupies tons of space in the Onondaga Register, this debate. And yeah, the issue of slavery is very important. Remember, at this point in time, slavery still exists in the state of New York. So there is a debate going on in the state simultaneously as the Erie Canal is being built. And again, this is known as the era of good feelings, largely known as that because there's only one political party, the Democratic Republican Party, as it's called. James Monroe is the president. He's actually going to run for re-election in 1820, the results of which are going to be wildly different than in 2020 because James Monroe wins all but one electoral vote. He runs unopposed. So not a controversial election at all there. It's after Monroe leaves, though, that these splinters, especially around the issue of slavery and also internal improvements, which is a fancy name for things like roads, canals, and railroads, are going to kind of form the basis of the next set of political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. And we're going to see a lot of politics kind of play in, or some politics playing into what happens along the Erie Canal in 1820. And finally, there is the Second Great Awakening, which is this religious revival that's happening all over the United States, especially in the Northeast, and especially in the western part of New York. It's famously now called the Burned Over District because the fires of religious revivalism were everywhere. And in almost every Onondaga register, there is just a spot set aside to talk about revivals of religion. Also of note here, in 1820, again, something the Onondaga Register doesn't talk about, but it's going to have a tremendous effect on the Erie Canal, on the nation. It's occurring only a few miles away, maybe out by, maybe like 100 miles away, out by Rochester, in the little village of Palmyra. In 1820, Joseph Smith is going to have his first vision. These visions will eventually lead him to write the Book of Mormon and found the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. It has its birth right here on the Erie Canal. So that's the world into which the Erie Canal is being born. So now, let's look at what was going on in 1820. First, a city yet, you'll see why this is brought up. Let's look at one community along this new canal route, specifically the community that existed at the intersection of the Genesee and Salina roads, two ancient roads or transportation routes, at which a small community had grown up that had gone by numerous names. South Salina, originally, a man by the name of Henry Bogardus had formed a tavern there. It's called South Salina because to its north was the far more important town of Salina, located on Onondaga Lake, where they boiled salt primarily. Eventually, that tavern gets sold to a man whose last name is Cossett. This community gets known as Cossett's Corners at one point. They try several times to get a post office, first trying out the name Milan. That's taken by what is now known as Locke, New York. And then they try Corinth. Again, that is rejected. There's another Corinth out by the Catskills. It's about that time that this man over here, Joshua Foreman, arrives in Corinth or Milan, whichever you'd like to call it. Joshua Foreman, he's a land speculator, and he sees a ton of potential for this community that the canal is passing through, being so close to the salt fields to the north of here and Onondaga Lake. He had actually in 1809, he had been the first person ever to propose a canal across the state. He had seen this well in advance that a canal would be incredibly beneficial. He is the first person to propose this in the New York State Assembly. And it's that bill that gets some of the first ever surveys of the Erie Canal produced. Foreman's eventually going to live here, right on the banks of the Erie Canal, in what is nowadays known as Clinton Square, because, spoiler alert, the community I'm talking about is Syracuse. The postmaster of this little community is a man by the name of John Wilkinson. He is in New York City visiting friends, probably dejected / angry at the post office for rejecting him so many times for a name, but he's reading a book of poetry from a young British author, the 14th Lord of Derby, who will eventually become a 3-time prime minister of the United Kingdom. But he reads a poem that had won awards that this 20-year-old lord had written at Oxford about Syracuse, Sicily. Thinks it has a lot of similarities to this little town that he is postmaster of. So he applies for Syracuse, and thus it gets its name. And speaking of getting its name, where did this slide get its name from? Well, also in 1820, a New York City newspaper editor by the name of William Stone visits Syracuse, most likely taking the Erie Canal, and he's chatting with Joshua Foreman, who's often called the father of Syracuse. And he tells Foreman, "You call this a village? It would make an owl weep to fly over it." To which Foreman replied, "We will make it a city yet." And how true that was, and in large part thanks to this grand canal that we're going to look at more closely. So, as you know, if you're from upstate New York, not a ton goes on here in the winters, especially in the early 1800s, basketball didn't exist. So I don't know how people occupied themselves at that point in time. But April, come she will. By she, I mean the Montezuma, but I have to reference Simon and Garfunkel when I can. So let's look at what happened once the snow started to melt, the ice started to thaw, and they started to fill that canal with water. Well, first on April 13th, the state legislature produced an incredible bill making it illegal to kill muskrats in the state of New York, with one large exception. That exception, if that muskrat was anywhere near the Erie Canal. Muskrats had a tendency, they were the bane of canalers for years. They like to dig burrows into the sides of the canal, which of course weaken it. And you weaken a canal bank long enough, that canal bank stops to exist, as do your boats, because they go flowing out of the side of the canal. So that's a cool little thing. Also on April 13th, though, big day in canal history, April 13th, 1820, the Montezuma is launched. And what is the Montezuma? Well, it was a packet boat built in Montezuma. It was 76 feet long, 14 feet wide. It had two cabins, one for passengers and the other for the crew and for cooking for the passengers. It was the state-of-the-art packet boat on the canal. The chief engineer was also a packet boat, but not of the same caliber, from what we understand, as the Montezuma. And it was built in Montezuma by this man, Comfort Tyler, who is a fascinating character. Again, I recommend checking out our YouTube video on the launching of the Montezuma to find out more about him. Tyler, Revolutionary War soldier, moved out here to Onondaga County after the war, participated in some of the early salt boiling, was a very prominent member of society here. He even went to the New York State Assembly, where he met Mr. Aaron Burr, everyone's favorite vice president, who was also charged with murder. He accompanies Burr to Ohio, where he ends up fooling around, gets charged with treason, which ruins his entire political fortunes, and he kind of leaves Onondaga County in disgrace, moving to Montezuma on the Seneca River, which he foresees as having a lot of potential, especially if a canal gets built there. So he's a vocal fan of canals. He will eventually take out a contract to help build sections of the canal. He also builds a bridge over the Seneca River. He builds turnpikes, so on and so forth. And along with a man in Rome by the name of Simon Newton Dexter, they purchase the chief engineer of Rome and begin the first ever packet line, the Erie Canal Navigation Company, which is going to be a major company on the canal during its early years, owning, I believe, 9 boats by the time the canal's open, and they're going to run a regular packet service. But that's getting a little ahead of ourselves, isn't it? The Montezuma, when it launches on April 13th, it's really the people of Montezuma who celebrate at the time. They run it through Montezuma's Lock, which we're going to see again later in this presentation. And on April 20th, they decided to start taking it farther down the canal. And the Montezuma enters Syracuse. This is often cited as the first ever packet boat to enter Syracuse. Though other research that's been done shows that there may have been other boats that had entered Syracuse before 1820, possibly in 1819 or earlier in the year, and even possibly other passenger boats. But more research still needs to be done on that, I would say. Also, the Montezuma, once it gets Syracuse, heads up the Salina side cut, which would eventually morph into the Oswego Canal. At the moment, it's only 1.5 miles long, goes to Salina, where all that salt is. So you can kind of see already the importance of salt. And that Salina side cut, if I looked out my window over here, I could see where that would have been. The Erie Canal Museum today is at the juncture of these two canals. So that's what goes on there. The chief engineer, Tyler's other boat, arrives a few days later, and they're really going to start regular passage in between Montezuma and Utica. Especially once we get into May. The canal season will open officially in May of 1820. Navigation begins. Also, that's when this fella here on my left, DeWitt Clinton, he is reelected governor in May. At this point in New York history, Election Day falls at the end of April or the beginning of May. So we get reports in the Onondaga Register of Clinton widening his lead in 1820. Why wouldn't he be? The canal has proven a success. His ditch, as it's sometimes referred to. And what better way to celebrate getting elected governor than going on a tour of the newly built middle section of the canal, which he does in mid-May. And he is accompanied on this journey by two incredibly interesting characters. One is Myron Holly, who is the treasurer of the Canal Commission. He is the only one of the canal commissioners who, that's just his only job. DeWitt Clinton is also a canal commissioner, but he's also busy being governor and whatnot. Myron Holly, he's the treasurer. He's the guy who's largely making sure that the canal gets completed, that contractors get paid, so on and so forth. So he's pretty important in the history of the canal. Also important because in 1839, he is going to help found what is known as the Liberty Party, the first abolitionist political party in the United States, right down the canal in Rochester. Also accompanying Clinton is Jedediah Morse. His mission, along with Clinton, is actually described several months earlier in the Onondaga Register. He had been commissioned by the government to go out into the Great Lakes area and all the way to the Great Plains to interact with the various Native American tribes farther west, to document them, to make contact with them, and also to document kind of the landscape. He's almost a Lewis and Clark type figure, you could see him as. And he is considered one of the early founders of American geography, even. His reports are very insightful in numerous ways about this. Morse is probably most famous, though, for being the father of Samuel Morse, the inventor of the telegraph. But he's accompanying DeWitt Clinton on Clinton's way west to the Seneca River, and from there Morse is going to head on, but we'll get to that shortly. This boat, forget if I forgot to mention, this talk is going to be kind of Syracuse heavy in what we talk about here, because we're in Syracuse, and also it's going to become the central city, really, of this middle section. So they set out from Utica, another incredibly important city on this middle section. And on May 22nd, they arrive in Syracuse. To great pomp and circumstance, they're greeted with a cannonade. I don't know, I haven't seen anything about the Whit Clinton's hearing, but I can't imagine it's that great because every single time I read about him going anywhere, people are firing cannons near him. So, you know, that will take a toll on your hearing, I would imagine, after a while. But he enters Syracuse to the sound of cannons. People like Joshua Foreman give him speeches talking about how great the Erie Canal is and whatnot. But it's not that big of a celebration. Fascinating thing in Jared Kopel's book that he talks about is how celebrations on the Erie Canal, they almost parallel how the engineers become more skilled. The state of New York becomes much, much more skilled at throwing big parties to celebrate itself and the completion of this great canal. So this first entrance into Syracuse isn't that grand, but it's a good one. And the next morning, the travelers head on farther west to Montezuma. Jedediah Morris keeps on going. DeWitt Clinton, I believe, heads back to Albany, and Myron Holley probably sticks around the area so he can keep paying people to keep building the Erie Canal. So that's the first time the governor takes a tour of the canal. It won't be the last, though. Only a couple months later, Clinton will be back in central New York, back in Syracuse. I've got this lovely picture of our crowd at the Carrier Dome during the basketball game. Everyone knows Syracuse, Syracuseans, Central New Yorkers. You know, we know how to party. It's nothing new to us. And really, this 4th of July is the first big celebration here in Central New York. It's going to make Central Syracuse kind of the center of the state, not just geographically, but psychically as well. Everyone's attention in the state is turned to Syracuse. And Syracuseans are planning this party for months. We can see that in the Onondaga Register. They also didn't have Syracuse basketball to pay attention to like we have here. So they had to distract themselves. I mean, Jim Boeheim, he was just a young man at this point in 1820. So basketball hadn't been invented yet even. So Syracuse is getting ready. There's numerous notices in the paper telling everybody to wear their finest military uniforms and whatnot. Also, I'm sure a lot of us here can relate to this. They were like, hey, at this party in Syracuse, we are celebrating like the Erie Canal. We're celebrating the 4th of July. Please leave your politics out of this. So, the newspaper was, doing the equivalent of telling your annoying uncle, like, could you not talk about politics this year at like Thanksgiving? That sort of thing. So let's look at this celebration, shall we? On July 4th, 73 boats arrive at the locks that surround Syracuse. On the eastern and western side, there's a few other boats in this line of side cut. This is the most boats that's really ever been assembled on the canal at this point. Clinton, as well as several other dignitaries, such as William Van Ness, Aaron Burr's back in the story. Van Ness was Aaron Burr's second in his famous duel. They're all on board this packet boat, the Oneida Chief. They're coming from the east, and at 10 a.m., here's another cannon. A signal cannon is fired, and all the boats descend on Salina Basin, which, as I mentioned, right outside my window over here, where the Erie Canal Museum was the epicenter of this grand celebration. And this flotilla meets here at Salina Basin. They disembark and march down a couple blocks to Clinton, what is now Clinton Square. It wasn't at the time, but they hadn't named it yet. To the southern bank, to Joshua Foreman's house, where speeches are read, the Declaration of Independence is read, a prayer is said, so on and so forth. The Onondaga Register estimated between 5,000 and 10,000 people were at this event. Remember, Syracuse in 1820 has 250 residents, so this is a massive, massive crowd, never before really seen in central New York. So this crowd gathers, as might be expected, in this era without microphones and whatnot. You can't really hear the speakers, according to the Onondaga Register. They say that the keynote speaker for the event had a beautiful speech, but no one heard it because the 5,000 to 10,000 people, they were like these folks here. You know, you try going to the Carrier Dome and hearing something. You can't. It's the loud house. It's been that way since 1820. Anyway, once the speakers get off the stage, people start to realize, you know, time to leave. This part of the party's over, and they move up the Salina side cut on boats, on wagons, by foot, horseback, so on and so forth, up to Salina for what's really the main event, which is kind of a combination of a fair and a luncheon. So all the counties of Western New York have brought their finest goods up to Salina, where they meet, show them off. Everyone can visit the different booths for the different counties. These counties have been invited, like I said, by the Onondaga Register and everything. There's also a lunch served in a nice shady bower of trees. And on top of that, this is kind of the main event, which are a series of toasts which occur. There's 13 official ones, and again, we see what we talked about at the beginning, this kind of democratic exuberance in these toasts. They're toasting things like the nation, the president, the governor, the 4th of July, and the Declaration of Independence in general. And also, the toast I find the most interesting in the official toast, they toast to the patriots in South America fighting for their freedom and for democracy. So that's what's going on there. There's also several unofficial toasts. As you know, I assume as people drank more and more toasts, they felt like giving even more and more. They talk about just all sorts of great things. So that goes on. Sounds like a rollicking party, but they managed to get everyone out of there by 5. And the newspaper is very proud to report that everyone did indeed keep politics out of it. You know, there were no incidents to report. Everyone was just nice and happy about the Erie Canal coming through. It was great. So all quiet on the central front. Well, there would be no more cannon blasts in central New York for the rest of the year. But I think this is where the story really gets interesting. If you've read the book All Quiet on the Western Front, you might know that there's all this fighting going. It's a World War I book. All this fighting's going on. The main character, spoiler alert, dies at the end, and the general receives a report saying, all quiet on the Western Front. But everything wasn't all quiet on the Western Front. It just meant that there weren't any major offensives or anything going on. Similarly, here in Syracuse, we don't have these loud cannon blasts, these giant processions anymore. But this is the nitty-gritty of the Erie Canal in 1820. Okay, and the canal is transforming central New York, and the economic impact of this canal can be seen immediately. Here we have a picture of the lock in Montezuma. It's on the enlarged canal, but our story kind of picks up here at this lock, what is called Lock 8 in the Onondaga Register. It would eventually become Lock 61 once the whole canal is complete. However, you know, there are only 8 locks really on the canal at this point, because this is the part that needed the fewest locks. And in this report, it's just for the month of June for boat passages through Lock 8 out in Montezuma. And you can remember, this is the second month of Erie Canal navigation and on the farthest western lock. So presumably the most difficult one to reach, the least likely one to be used, because more people live to the east, far less on the western end of the canal. But let's look at what they say went through this lock in just 1 month. There are 146 passages of this lock. Another important thing to remember, in 1820, there hadn't been a canal here until this year. Where are these boats even coming from? Remember, there were 73 on the 4th of July. People were just building these boats, like, they're not like when the heydays of the canal, when there were just thousands of boats already kind of there. So these boats are being built like at this time. So 146 boats passing through. Granted, there are obviously repeat customers on this lock. Still impressive though. And 74 of those boats are carrying passengers. Others are, not passengers, are carrying cargoes. Others are packet boats with passengers on them, recreational boats, empty boats, so on and so forth. But on those 74 cargo boats, we can see just the massive change that is happening in Erie, in central New York, almost immediately. The Onondaga Register reports 3,776 barrels of flour, 2,438 bushels of wheat, 776 barrels of salt, 334 barrels of pork, all passing through this one lock in Montezuma. Comfort Tyler's being proved right about his investments in Montezuma at this time. Sadly for him, I guess, this will kind of be the high water mark for Montezuma, if you will, when it's the western terminus of the canal. It won't be for long, but I digress. You can see, especially all of this wheat and flour that's being passed through these locks. These are bulk goods like salt, flour, and wheat. I just read a great book on salt by Mark Kurlansky, who mentions how with bulk goods like salt, the only way to make them profitable is to make them as cheap as possible, their production and their transportation. And this is what's really transforming New York, is making it so massive quantities of goods like this can be easily and cheaply transported. It would have taken about a week probably to get from Montezuma to Utica beforehand. It is going to take maybe 2 days now to make that trip. We also see it in numerous letters that are published in the Onondaga Register. One by Hibernicus. That is a pen name that DeWitt Clinton was writing under. He claims to see at one point a raft of 440 tons of lumber traveling down the canal. And also a fellow by the name of Cayuga. That's also another pen name. They love to do that in the 1800s, right under these kind of assumed names. Anyway, Cayuga, he makes a very strong argument in what's called Practical Remarks on the Canal, talking a lot about that flour and wheat I was talking about, how at that time, New York, especially New York City, were entirely dependent on southern flour and wheat. And this canal was going to end their dependence. It's kind of like nowadays we talk a lot about ending our dependence on foreign oil, foreign energy. Well, Cayuga wanted to end our terrible addiction to foreign flour and wheat, and he thought the Erie Canal was the way that we were going to do that. I'll see in the Onondaga Register a discussion of the salt tax. The state of New York, recognizing that salt manufacturers, especially in and around Syracuse, are going to profit tremendously from the canal due to the ease of shipping, they impose a rather considerable tax on salt of 62.5 cents per barrel. And that is, remember I said, to make selling salt profitable, you need to make it as cheap as possible. And before the canal went through, the Onondaga Register reports that salt was selling at between $3 and $3.50 per barrel. And that was a lot back then. You add on another 62.5 cents, Syracuse wouldn't have been able to sell its salt. However, what the Register reports is that by September, the price of that barrel of salt without the tax on it is cut in half to $1.50 to $2 max. So you're saving, even with that pretty substantial tax, about 50 cents per barrel. And the Register reports it's just going to get cheaper because salt manufacturers hadn't seen a reduction in lumber prices yet. So once they can get cheaper lumber, they can boil that salt for even cheaper, sell that salt for cheaper, and make more money. Weird how that works, but still. Also speaking of taxes, so this salt tax is going to pay off a considerable amount of canal revenues. It's estimated about a third of the original $7 million is paid for in salt taxes. They will also, the state will create a system of tolls for boats. Different toll collectors will be placed in a number of different villages along the canal. Montezuma here in Syracuse, in Rome, in Utica. I know I'm missing some. I want to say Canastota. They may have had another person. The highest paid of those toll collectors is right here in Syracuse. It is Joshua Foreman. He sets up, not here at the Waylock building, which would eventually assume this role of collecting tolls on boats. He sets up pretty close to here on what is known as Goose Island. It was this artificial island that had been formed by the intersection of this Lina side cut and the Erie Canal. So where that parking lot is nowadays, if you come to the Erie Canal Museum, that's where Joshua Foreman's little toll booth would have been. And they would have measured those tolls by water displacement. It would have been more estimated. They were focusing on building the canal, so building waylocks was still a ways off. Also, you can see how much interest is being drawn by these canals by the fact that numerous towns, it's reported, are discussing the possibility of building side canals from the main branch of the Erie to their towns. The Onondaga Register reports that in August, Auburn, New York, will discuss building a side canal, and also in August, Canandaigua will discuss building side canals to tap into this incredible stream of wealth. What I find really interesting about both those reports is, if you know your New York State canals, you know that neither of those two communities got a canal. However, Auburn, I know at least, will become a major railroad center. But the could have beens there. Also, we see in the Onondaga Register that upstate New York is becoming a real tourist destination. Some people are coming just to see this incredible engineering marvel that is the Erie Canal. Many more, though, are traveling even farther west, especially to see Niagara Falls, which is going to become the first ever major tourist destination in the United States, thanks in large part to this canal, which allows you to go see the awe-inspiring Niagara Falls. And like the Erie Canal is going to see some of the first ever travel guides in the United States. They're going to pop up talking about what you can see on and around the Erie Canal. So not everything's great on the canal, though. I would like to emphasize that. I think often we in the canal world talk almost always about just all the great things the Erie Canal accomplished, all this progress and economic opportunity, which is true, that occurred. But there are also sadder stories with the canal. For instance, we have a discussion of a man by the name of Hendricks in the Onondaga Register, who apparently he'd been drinking a bit too much one night and fell into the locks on the east side of Syracuse and drowned in it. So that's one of the sadder tales of the canal, but an even sadder story that it's not explicitly talked about in the Onondaga Register, but one we can find the skeleton of it is in the Onondaga Register. You just have to know what you're looking for. And one of the things that the Erie Canal really does is encourage a lot of land speculation, and a lot of people start moving to New York, so they obviously need land to live on. Here is a report from the Surveyor General giving notice that the state will be selling off numerous plots of land on October 3rd, 1820, they're going to be putting them up for auction. I believe the article says for $25 you can purchase these lots. And we see a lot of them near the Erie Canal. Chittenango, Oswego, well, that's not officially on the Erie Canal, but you can tell Oswego's going to get a canal soon. Camillus, Cicero, Lysander, Pompey. Brutus is relatively close to the Erie Canal. See these places, but you will also notice on this newspaper a number of lots that are part of the Oneida Reservation. Here's the Oneida Reservation again, the Onondaga Reservation. Those are up for sale. And that's a really interesting thing and a really tragic thing. So let's look specifically at the Oneida Reservation. This is following the Treaty of Fort Stanwix and Fort Canandaigua in the late 1700s. The Oneidas, one of the 6 tribes of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, were left with this reservation, which was millions of acres of land. If you know the canal, it runs through right about here. And these lands were supposed to be protected for the Oneidas under those treaties I mentioned, as well as the Non-Intercourse Act of 1790, as well as Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution, which the Commerce Clause, which says that only the federal government has authority to really negotiate with Native American tribes. It is largely ignored at this point in American history, especially in the state of New York. The state believes they have the right to negotiate, and slowly but surely, the Oneidas are dispossessed of much of this land. This map from 1810 actually shows one of the largest ones These plots of land are where Peter Smith, many of you may know his son Garrett Smith, Peterborough. He purchases these from the Oneidas. More land is purchased throughout. And yeah, while I'm on this subject, I must recommend the book Conspiracy of Interests by Lawrence Hoffman, which talks about how the Haudenosaunee were kind of systemically dispossessed of their land, in large part to make way for giant infrastructure projects like the Erie Canal and its side canals. So I just wanted to talk about that. We posted on Facebook earlier this week an article about Comfort Tyler. Someone mentioned how he might have been responsible for dispossessing, I believe, the Cayugas or Seneca of some of their land. So I think this is just an important story to keep in mind when you're looking at the overall story of the Erie Canal. It's not all rosy. But now let's move on to talk a little more about what's going on along the canal. Can you dig it? The rest of the canal, that is. Building of the Erie Canal didn't stop in 1820. We just had 96 of 363 miles. So a lot of stuff kept happening on the canal. And engineers were highly praised in the Onondaga Register. Remember, they had had no experience in 1817. By 1820, they're starting to become a real well-oiled machine. And you can see that in the Onondaga Register's reports. One of the reports is, here's Palmyra again, a better route was found between Palmyra and Lyons, cutting about 1.5 miles off of the overall route. So you can see their surveying abilities are getting better. David Thomas, noted canal engineer, starts investigating the northern route. That's what I have kind of here on the screen. So there was a debate, which we also talked about in one of our quarantine coffee hours, about how to get from the Genesee River here over to Lake Erie. And there were two kind of different thoughts. One was you could take a more southerly, more direct route. The big issue is this, what's known as the Mountain Ridge. It's now known as the Niagara Escarpment. The other, which is ultimately what was chosen, was the northern route, which David Thomas is investigating here. It's going to go below the Niagara Escarpment until it gets right here to this little notch. It's known what is now Lockport, where it will surmount the Niagara Escarpment and get over here to Lake Erie and ultimately Buffalo. Again, check out our YouTube page to find out a whole lot more about that debate, as well as Lockport. We've got talks on it all. Another important milestone on July 22nd, the canal, it was actually 95 miles, essentially, until this part was made in 1820. A few more, about 1 mile more is dug to get to Genesee Street in Utica. Genesee Street is, again, one of the oldest roads in upstate New York. So that's a major accomplishment. It's very much celebrated in the Onondaga Register. Also, the engineers come up with a unique way to supply what's known as the Northern Canal. Now, we would probably call it, we do call it today, the Champlain Canal. This is the famous, for those of us in the canal world, Glens Falls feeder, which feeds the Champlain Canal with water from the Hudson, which is really unique because the Champlain Canal ultimately enters, well, its terminus is at the Hudson River. So this Hudson River water is taking a really circuitous route to get right where it would have been to begin with. A canal like the Erie Canal doesn't have a setup like this. We're fed with water from Lake Erie, which is the highest point, and the terminus is the Hudson River. So that's just a pretty neat little thing. Look into it further. Maybe someday we'll do a talk on Glens Falls feeder. There are a few little hiccups that they've run into as far as building the canal is concerned. We have a report of a canal wall out by Wood Creek, which is near Rome. That gives out delays boats for a whole weekend. Another less accidental incident that occurs is happens out in Whitesboro. A man is arrested for knocking a hole in, intentionally knocking some kind of hole into the side of the canal. Didn't give motives. I almost think it may have been to kind of steal water from the canal to water his crops. But whatever happens there, he's going to get arrested. He will be fined to repair the damage in the wall, and he gets another nice little fine tacked on top of that. We also see a lot more interest from the state in keeping this project going, especially later in the year. I think, so they opened up, they had initially authorized this first 96 miles as kind of an experiment. And in 1820, it is pretty obvious that that experiment is paying off. So we get an advertisement in the Onondaga Register for a bond issued by the state of $151,000. Has a 6% return. That would get paid off in 1837, just in time to invest in all sorts of other canal projects. What could go wrong there? If you know canals, you know what could go wrong there. And then also on November 17th, it is announced that the New York State Senate has passed a bill authorizing $1 million annually for the next 2 years to continue the digging of the canal. And that right there pretty much seals the deal that the Erie Canal is going to get completed. That is a whopping amount of money for the New York State Legislature to approve. And the progress that will be made in those next 2 years and the money invested will make it so the state cannot back out of this. And also the Onondaga Register projects that by the end of the next year, now that they have this money to continue, by the end of 1820, the canal between Rochester and Montezuma will be halfway completed. So in 1821, the canal's going to almost double in length getting out to Rochester and the Genesee River. So that is what happened on the canal. Here's a little bonus content. I couldn't find a way to incorporate this into the main body of the talk, but I love this article I found in the Onondaga Register, in which this was apparently published in numerous newspapers around the country. They list all of the weights in 1783 of a bunch of Revolutionary War officers. I especially like it because me and George Washington are about the same size and height, but we have a couple of neat outliers. First Secretary of War, Henry Knox, and also General Huntington, a whopping 132 pounds. Real skinny guy. So there is the canal in 1820. And I only went a little over an hour, so kind of proud of myself there. Anyone have any questions? I will stop sharing my screen now.
And we will go ahead and let me figure out how to allow participants to unmute themselves. Okay. You are all welcome to unmute. We do have a couple of questions that I've got here for you, Derrick. Precise location today of the Foreman House on July 4th. Who gave the main speech? What was his position in relation to other dignitaries there?
Yes. I have that answer somewhere, not on hand. I know where the Foreman House was. That would have been where the atrium is now. I believe that's what it's called, on the southern side of the canal. Would have been on Water Street. I think it might have been the intersection of Water Street and Pennsylvania Street, I believe. It was either that or the intersection of Water Street and Clinton Street, one of the two sides, that block. what were the other? Oh, who gave the main speech? I have that in my records somewhere here. But I will try to get back to
Is that in your 4th of July talk? Do you get into that
Yes.
detail?
Oh, yeah, I get it. Every single person who was like listed as being there.
Yeah. I thought you did.
Yeah.
Also, a question about Jesse Hawley. His proposed route as presented in the Genesee Messenger, how is it similar to the actual route taken and the David Thomas proposal?
So very similar. However, Jesse Hawley's route, of course, called for an inclined plane. That's a major difference. And I actually must have had it going in the northern route because I've seen most accounts say that it was very thin. Also, if you took the more southerly route, you would have had to surmount like kind of hills. His whole plan was to have Lake Erie water feed the whole canal all the way to Albany. So I would assume it was similar on that northerly track, but I would have to get back to you on that one. I see a person in the Facebook comments asked if the isolated central section was open first, were all the 73 boats at the opening built at newly created boat yards on the canal? I do not believe so. Many of them would have been kind of repurposed, like Durham boats and bateau that would have been used on the existing river systems that were hooked up by the canal. And I don't know if they were official boat yards really, where boats like the Montezuma were being made. I think people were just like, let's put something in the water at this point. Are there any other questions?
Yes, I've got some other questions. The book that you recommended about the Haudenosaunee lands.
Yes, I will try to put that. So
yeah, you can put that in the chat box.
Conspiracy of Interest by Lawrence Hauptman.
Okay, and Francesca has a couple of questions. Francesca, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, you can ask your questions now.
Hello, this is actually her son, but who
we'll
absolutely loves history. Actually wanted to ask a question about the impact, the political impact of the canal. It seems when you were talking about this, it seems like the canal was one of the primary, well, not one of the primary, but one of the canal and its kind of liberation of New York from Southern flour and things like that. It kind of seems like that was one of the starts to the tensions between the North and the South, the economic tensions, where the North was becoming steadily less dependent on Southern goods. Would you say that either directly or indirectly, significantly directly or indirectly, my brain's not fully turned on yet, sorry, contribute to the Civil War, or do you think that it's...
I would say almost definitely. So one of the big arguments that Jared Copel makes in Bond of Union is that it kind of, these infrastructure projects almost divide the nation rather than east-west. They kind of unite east and west, but make, as you identified, this kind of north-south split. In fact, in one of Cayuga's letters, the one where he's talking about getting us off dependence on Southern flour and wheat, he mentions that the immorality of consuming that wheat anyway, because it was produced by the labor of enslaved people, and kind of contrast that, which I found a bit hypocritical since New York also had slavery at the time, but you know, it was in the process of being gradually abolished in New York by 1820. But yeah, I think overall, the canal and a lot of what's going on there starts to make the North not economically dependent on the Erie, on the South anymore. Also expands free labor much more. That leads to a lot of opposition to slavery as well. So yes, in short.
If I can ask another question, I don't want to take too much of your time, but I just have one more question. My family and I tend to talk about the modern New York, where from kind of like the age of industrialization forward, it steadily became this economic powerhouse of the United States, this economic and political powerhouse. Would you say that the Erie Canal was the birth of that process, or would you say that it was a direct contributor?
I would say, yeah, it's certainly a direct contributor. Really, they don't start calling New York the Empire State until like kind of following the construction of the canal. There's a great book that lists like the foundation of the Manhattan Bank and the creation of the Erie Canal is what makes the New York State the Empire State. This is really gonna make kind of New York kind of the most important state in the Union. You'll see like right after, it's why Virginians often did not support on a federal level supporting the Erie Canal. And you'll also see Martin Van Buren shortly after the Erie Canal was built. We're going to get our first president from New York State and far less from Virginia following the completion of this canal. So yeah, I would argue that the Erie Canal is really the main driver in that.
All right, thank you so much. I don't want to ask any more questions. I feel like if I do, I'll keep you here for hours. It's like a major passion of mine. So thank you for answering my questions.
No problem. I also just found in my notes here a quick answer to the person about the 4th of July. The keynote speaker at the 4th of July in front of Foreman's House was a man by the name of Samuel M. Hopkins. He was from Leroy, now the home of the Jell-O Museum. He was a former congressman from Western New York. So I don't know what his exact relationship was with like with Clinton and everything, but he was recognized as an important guy, so they had him speak.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. So thank you all so much for joining us.
Constantine, did you have a question? It looked like you were kind of raising your hand there at one point. Oh, okay. All right. Oh, all right. Yeah. I confused that. Okay. Well, these were some great questions that I asked.
Yeah.
That's what I always like.
Sometimes Q&As are light and fluffy, but no, these were good. Keeping you on your toes, Derrick.
Yes.
Thank you all again so much. We will have this video available on our YouTube channel, along with those 3 other videos that Derrick mentioned before, exploring the 1820 navigation year. So we will make sure that we share that link with everyone. The YouTube link was shared at the beginning, so you can find it there. And thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Go Qs, beat the Irish.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Great talking with you. All right. See you later.